Welcome to another episode of Resources for Humans. I'm your host, Jack Altman, the CEO here at Lattice. And today we are actually at our office where we've got the nice car honking outside, but more importantly, we have Elad Gil joining us. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk a little bit about your book, but before we get into that, I want to hear about your background. Looking at the beginning of the book, we can see a sort of dizzying background. You have one of the broadest backgrounds. You've gotten a PhD. You've worked at McKinsey and Google. You've founded and sold a company. You've been a VP at Twitter. You started Color Genomics, where you're now the chairman. And somehow along the way, you've managed to invest in a bunch of companies like Airbnb, Coinbase, Gusto, Lattice, many other of like the most impressive companies in Silicon Valley. How have you thought about managing your own career?
I think the way I think about careers is ultimately, how do you think about the set of things that create the most opportunities at each stage, and what are the networks that you want to be part of? So I think it's much more important to optimize for being part of a core network or great group of people in Silicon Valley than it is to necessarily fight for a very specific career path. And then I think in parallel, really what you want to do is find companies that are really breaking out and working and joining those, because I think growth ultimately creates the most set of opportunities. And so examples of that would be, if you look at a lot of the early employees at Google, so you had Marissa Mayer, who became the CEO of Yahoo. I think she was in the first 10 people. You had Susan Wojcicki, who became the CEO of YouTube. She was somewhere in the first 15 people or so. Really what happened is they joined companies that were these massive engines for growth, and that allowed them to have these outsized careers over time because they were early, they got the trust of the founding team and the executive team, and they sort of grew up with it. So number one is join a breakout company. Number two is join a key network. And I think number three is just do good work, and hopefully things will just work out.
What's been the role for you in investing as you've been operating? I think you've managed to balance both of those. Have those compounded together, or has it been sort of splitting up a pie?
Yeah, I think they definitely feed off of each other, because as you invest in companies, you get to know different founders, you exchange ideas, so there's things you can take back to your own company. I think the key thing you have to be really careful about is to carve out the time properly so that it doesn't impact your ability to operate your own company. And I think that's where a lot of founders end up failing, is they get distracted by their investments or get distracted by other people's companies, when really the number one priority always has to be their own thing. So one piece of advice that I got really early was to say, carve out very specific blocks of time. So you could say every lunch hour or every other lunch hour is investing, or only on Saturdays I'm going to meet with companies, or whatever it is, and then try to stick to it, because as you end up with a dozen or more companies that you're involved with, you end up with there's always an emergency or there's always somebody to help, so it can get really distracting.
How planned are your days? Are you blocking out what you want them to be like, or are you kind of taking what comes?
Yeah, in the pre-book world, I had more time to block things out, and since I'm doing different conversations for the book, it's been it's taken up the extra time that I had normally allocated. One big shift that I've had is, since I have a young child at home now, I've really also focused on blocking out time for them. And so often either mornings or evenings, I'm watching my son for an hour, hour and a half, and then I'll go and do other things. And so I try to make sure that I also have family time. And then the other thing I've been trying to block out consistently is also date night with my wife, so that I make sure that all the fundamental relationships in life are in good shape in addition to work, because that's really sort of the both primary goal, but also the support system that allows you, I think, to thrive.
Speaking of your wife and son, in the front of the book, the dedication was, to my wife and son, suddenly everything is possible again. I noticed that. What does that mean?
Yeah, Jonathan Safran Foer has this book called Eating Animals, and in the book he talks about his relationship to his own young child, and in that, when his son was born, somebody actually sent him a card that said, suddenly everything is possible. And really what that means is that the full potential of a human life is now in this kid. In other words, you look at your child and you realize that they can do anything. They could be an Olympic skier. They could invent some new drug that cures a terrible disease, or they could also do much more nefarious things. But the full range of human possibility is suddenly available again, and you can review or relive life through that lens of seeing how they develop. So for me, it was a very poignant idea in that book.
Is this related to why you like startups, the sort of like pluripotence?
Yeah. I think fundamentally, I'm a strong believer that technology startups have dramatically impacted and changed the world for the better in the past, and they'll do so again. And it's amazing to watch a small organization, 2 people, 5 people, whatever, suddenly turn into a multi-thousand person organization that's global and doing things that's impacting people at the scale of humanity. And so if you look at some of the companies that I've been involved with over time, literal percentages of humanity are using their products, and that's a very powerful thing to realize, that these founders have created out of nothing something that has employed people or allowed them to make money off of their home, like Airbnb. It allows new companies to exist and thrive online, like Stripe. Like, you can sort of go through it. The creation of a whole new digital asset class, like what Coinbase is doing. And so these are really fundamental pieces of what the world does. And technology is one way to have real leverage on people's time. You can have a small group of people do something truly outstanding. And so that, to me, is one of the really exciting things about a startup.
You've seen a bunch of sort of cycles of life of startups. It feels to me right now like we are in some ways, like a negative part of the cycle, where a lot of the media thinks that companies are negative, and the sentiment feels more negative.
Yeah.
What is your take on this?
Yeah, I think some of it is deserved and some of it is not. And I think, like any business, there's going to be cycles of this. So, I remember at Google, in the early days, it was this innovative, exciting new company. And then there was sort of this middle period where it was a monopoly and they're doing bad things. And then it suddenly became a pure company again. And, there are these press cycles. And that happens to companies, and I think it's happening to tech as an industry, and I'm looking forward to the days when some of that press cycle sort of passes for the industry as a whole. I do think that there are clear issues or mistakes that companies have made along the way, either in terms of how they've built their culture, and there have been big blow-ups culturally for some companies, or data access for certain social networks. So there are real issues too that need to be addressed. But in parallel, I do agree that we're in part of a press cycle, and there's things that need to be fixed, and hopefully those things are fixed and people can sort of carry on in terms of doing good things. One thing that really bothered me, or that I worry about, is I think that optimism is a reflexive asset. In other words, the more that people believe that something can be done, the more likely it is that something great can happen. And so at Google, the main way that Larry Page would yell at you when I was there was if you came in and presented to the product review and you were too small in your thinking. And he would get upset sometimes and say, well, why isn't this team thinking bigger? Or why aren't they doing something that's more massive or more impactful or more important? And that created a self-sustaining loop where people would come in thinking really big and trying to do great things. And my biggest concern is that people have become more and more cynical, which means that thinking big is rewarded less or is made fun of, and it may prevent some really amazing things from happening.
So going back to the beginning of the cycle, when people are thinking big and crazy, what are the things when you're investing that you most look for? And maybe to put framing on that, team, product, and market. What do you focus on?
Yeah, I'm a very strong believer in Ratcliffe's law. Andy Ratcliffe is one of the founders of Benchmark, and he has this great saying, which is great team, terrible market, market wins. Terrible team, great market, market wins. And great team, great market, something magical happens. And really what that means is that the market dominates everything else. And if you have the right product fit for the market, or product market fit, then the market will literally pull the product out. In other words, you're building something, it may be half broken, but tons of people use it because it's so good relative to their alternatives of not having it. And often a sign of a product that's really going to work is it's really janky, the UI is terrible, and tons of people are using it. So I'm a very strong believer in product market fit as the primary driver. And the single most important aspect of that is what market are you in? And one thing I always wonder about is, are we fundamentally as a society or as an entrepreneurial community blocked by the number of great markets or the number of great founders? In other words, there's a lot of efforts to try and pull more founders in to start more companies, but there's actually lots and lots of great founders. There's thousands of technology companies started a year. And so really, I think they're just not directed at the right markets. Or alternatively, the markets aren't changing rapidly enough for there to be big opportunities. And that's why I think you have these technology cycles. Something changes. There's a why now for this startup? Why is it a good time to do it? And then founders can build really outsized companies based on that why now premise. Oh, now there are these social networks. Now there's the cloud. Now there's mobile. Really enable these massive companies to be created. So I often think that we're more market limited than founder limited. And I think a lot of early stage investors think the opposite.
So as an investor, do you think about a market and then look for a company that's building in it? Or do you look for companies with traction and follow those markets?
Yeah. It's gone both ways. So 6, 7 years ago, maybe longer now, it was very clear that SaaS was a really big movement in terms of there's all these pieces of infrastructure that people build over and over that would become companies or standalone companies. And so I invested in Stripe and PagerDuty and Optimizely and Gusto and Mailgun. So a variety of companies that were building pieces of Optimizely for A/B testing, pieces of the stack that everybody would need to use. And so there's a thesis there of, major components of an enterprise are just going to turn into services, and lots of people are going to use these services. More recently in crypto, similarly, it felt to me like there was a lot of different pieces of what I'd call like the crypto financial stack. So you need custody, you need derivatives exchanges, you need a prime brokerage. So there's a set of companies that make sense as things that you'd want to fund based on that.
Any calls for what the current markets that you think are likely to be big in 5 years are?
I would say three things. One is I think ongoing SaaS products will continue to be super interesting and large, and there's all sorts of applications there. And you see things come out of nowhere and become really interesting and big. Like Checker would be an example of that in terms of background checking API. And I think there's a set of services companies need to still build over and over again. So I wish somebody would do the exercise of taking apart a Fortune 500 company and saying for each slice, like what's the API and how do I sort of build that? The second thing is I think with each technology wave, there's a tens of billions of dollars semiconductor company created. So in the first wave of the sort of microcomputer or desktop computer, it was Intel and AMD. For mobile, it was ARM and Qualcomm. For networking, it was Broadcom. For graphic processing, it was NVIDIA. And so now, similarly, there's two new waves. There's crypto, which is basically Bitmain. And then there's machine learning. And if you look at the machine learning market, most people are using NVIDIA GPUs, but Google and others have built things like TPUs, tensor processing units, which are dramatically better performance and power consumption than a GPU for machine learning applications. And so I think there'll be one or more tens of billions of dollar companies in that market and in that segment. And so that's one area that I think in 5 years, everybody will say in hindsight, of course, there's this $10, $20 billion company.
What's your favorite time to invest, either as a company stage, like right at its infancy, or once it's gotten sort of scale going, and also in markets? Like, do you like investing very early in a market, or do you like investing at the beginning of the deployment phase?
Yeah, I've invested at all stages. Most of the things I've invested in have been quite early, but I've also invested in things late. And I think really it comes down to one, how much more growth does this company have and how much potential? How can I be helpful to it? And where can I help? And then is it just a market that I'm excited about, or something that they're working on that I think will be impactful? Ultimately, if you look at an early stage company, it has very limited surface area. There's only three things you need to do as an early stage company, and they're very hard to do. But you need to be able to find product market fit, which is insanely hard. You need to not run out of money. And you can't fight with your co-founders. And as long as you do those three things, you'll do great. I
think YC said co-founder breakups are like the #1 reason startups die.
Yeah, at that stage, I don't remember what year it was. There was one year where something like 30% of the YC companies died because of co-founder breakups. And I think that's when Paul Graham or somebody said that. And I thought it was a really keen insight, which is you fail because of fighting and you can't move forward and friction, or you fail because you run out of money. And the main reason you run out of money is you don't get product market fit. So those are kind of synonymous in some sense. For a late-stage company, it's really different. You suddenly are scaling your organization, you're hiring executives that you've never hired before, you're buying other companies, you're entering international markets, you're launching a second product, you're dealing with customers and sales. So there's a dozen different things that you're doing at scale that you've never done before, potentially. And so the surface area of a late-stage company is much more complex than the surface area of an early-stage company. And so having operated at different scale, it's also fun to be able to help out with those sorts of issues, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. The High Growth Handbook was to try and capture some of those lessons from working with companies that have really scaled up.
You mentioned one of your criteria is being able to be helpful. A lot of investors talk about being helpful to entrepreneurs. One of these sort of sticky quotes that I heard was Vinod Khosla saying that the vast majority of investors are not just not helpful, but are actually damaging. Mm-hmm. What's your take on investors and their sort of ability to help companies?
Yeah, I think there are a handful of people who are extraordinarily good and helpful. And then there's a set of people who can help from time to time with specific things. And then I agree, I think many investors just aren't that valuable to have on board. And so a key thing as a founder is you want to reference check people. You want to make sure that they've actually been helpful to companies they've been involved with. And I think you also just want to have the conversation around what the company or what the investor can actually help with. So I think that some investors really enjoy certain things. They may want to help with the business side of pricing and marketing, or they may really enjoy talking about fundraising. And I would try and figure out what they're good at and where they can help you and steer the conversations in that direction. Because sometimes people will go to different investors with questions that they just can't help with. And then secondly, I think it's sort of on the shoulders of the founder to make sure that their investor pool is aware of where they need help and send out updates on the progress of the company so that you as an investor actually are up to date, you know what they're looking for, and you can proactively help. And so I think the best founders that I know proactively will send out a monthly update, plus at the top of it, what are the key asks? How can you as a set of investors help me?
What are the other cap table related things that you've worked on as a founder, an employee at Twitter, and as an investor, is employee stock option sort of mechanisms? Mm-hmm. Obviously the common is in Silicon Valley is 4 years with a 1 year cliff. Mm-hmm. People have talked about other ideas. Do you have any strong feelings about how this should work?
I think the 4 year cycle feels about right to me. Originally I think it was 5 or 6 years even in Silicon Valley, and for a while in clean tech it sort of came back into being that. And there are also people who've experimented with differential vesting where it'll be 10% first year, 20% second year, 30, and then 40% through 4 years. I think maybe Snapchat and a few others did that. There's different reasons for taking different approaches on that. I'm a fan of just the simple 4 year, 1 year cliff, but there's lots of different models.
Okay, so to get into the book, I want to talk about what to do when a company starts hyperscaling. One of the things that you mentioned is that when you're growing really fast, it's a whole new company every 6 to 12 months. Mm-hmm. What are the main things executives should look out for, the main pitfalls to avoid the hiccups that happen along with that?
Yeah, I think you really have to start thinking much farther ahead than you did when you're an early stage company. Because when you're 6 or 12 or 15 people trying to figure out a product and just hoping that the thing works, your planning cycles tend to be short, and that's because you're on a very fast iteration speed to try and find product market fit. And so your timelines are very compressed, and they should be. As you start to really scale and you're going from 50 people to 1,000 people or 50 people to 5,000 people, you really have to start thinking ahead and asking what's the organizational scaffolding that you're going to need in the company. And that's going to shift because if you're 50 people, you're going to need a different org structure and set of people than if you're 500 people. And part of that is because the people will just be different. They're going to have different skill sets at working at different scales. But part of it also is that communication and other things change dramatically. And the set of things that you have to do also change. So if you suddenly have to do an international sales team, that may shift how you think about product, because how do you align product against international needs? Do you build a local team that's focused on international? Do you distribute it? There's lots of different models to it. And so you have to start being proactive about asking, not only what are we going to be doing now, but what are we going to be doing in 6 months and 12 months? And then how should we start staffing up against that? What's our hiring plan? What's our roadmap from a product, sales, marketing, et cetera perspective? And so you shift from a little bit more of an ad hoc mode into a much stronger sort of planning-centric mode.
So I've seen that reorgs can, both breathe new life into a company, but they also are challenging. How do you do a reorg?
Yeah, I think two things. First, org structures are ultimately an exercise in pragmatism. So there's no one right single org structure. And I think when people are reasonably early in their careers, they think, oh my gosh, this reorg happened. It must mean that people think this is right or wrong, or the old way was wrong, but really it should be viewed as an evolution. And when you set up your org, you should really be asking things like, where do I want a tie-break vote to happen in a function? So for example, if you want product and engineering to make coordinated but independent decisions, and then you want the CEO to make the final decision if there's tension between the two groups, then both should report up into the CEO. But if you wanted somebody else to make that decision lower on in the chain, then you sort of have the org join there. So one is just pragmatism, and then two is who on the team actually has the bandwidth to do things. So when I was at Twitter, Alex McGivory, who was the general counsel, at different times owned, I think, M&A, he owned trust and safety, he owned, I think he may have owned support. Like it was a things that a GC often, a general counsel, your chief legal person often would not own. But he owned it because he was a capable person who had extra bandwidth and could do it. And then eventually those areas would spin out to other people. Like when I came on board, M&A eventually reported to me. So things will change also based on the people you have in place. In terms of how to actually do the reorg, I think number one is you want to have clarity in terms of the organization you want to move to and why. And then you want to figure out a communication plan in terms of who do you inform in what sequence, and then how do you deal with complaints after the fact. I think the single biggest thing, though, is you want to do it fast. And sometimes you have to pre-announce that this org will change in a month or two because this leader left or other things happen. But in general, you want to create a sense of stability, and you want to do a reorg, if you can, in 24 hours, so that there isn't a lot of churn in terms of the people who are working in this organization. And often that churn is created by people's concerns for themselves. What does it mean for my job? What does it mean for the work that I'm doing? Is my work still going to be relevant? These sort of fear-driven questions start to arise. And so a lot of the focus on a reorg is to do it quickly so that those questions don't really bubble up.
A more negative version of a reorg is, you might think of, a layoff. And a lot of great companies go through layoffs.
Sure.
What are the sort of things that lead to that? Can they be avoided, or are they just part of sort of a healthy growing company?
Yeah, I think it's hard to ever know exactly everything that the company will and won't do in the future. And there's different ways that people will approach layoffs. Netflix, for example, sometimes will just shut down a unit and lay everybody off in that unit, and they won't really necessarily move people around as much. And that's driven by the fact that they think that there's a business driver that they have, and they realize that there isn't. And so they figure out how to sort of create a mechanism to help people find jobs, give them severance, et cetera. But they kind of wholesale sometimes shut things down. So sometimes it's just your business or the thing that you think you're doing changes, and you have to adapt to it, and you may need a different set of people to do that. So I think there's a dozen different reasons that you may have to do a layoff. So it's kind of complicated.
I think when a company is growing really fast, there's also a lot of pressure to hire very quickly into the opportunity. Mm-hmm. Some roles, the payback is relatively fast, maybe like sales. Mm-hmm. Some the payback is very long, like an engineer. Mm-hmm. How, as a fast-growing startup, should you decide to hire 20 or 40 or 70 engineers this year? Yeah. Way ahead of a layoff or anything like that.
Yeah, I think you need to look at a few factors. Number one is, how's your business actually scaling? So when will you have enough revenue and margin to support those individuals? So one key thing is, again, just having a financial planning process and then mirroring that against your headcount plan. The second is, what are the sets of things that you need to do or not do across different areas? Do you really need a 1,000-person engineering team if you have a simple e-commerce product? And really, maybe what you should be investing in is operations and sales. So it also depends on the type of business you have and where scaling the team will actually help drive your business forward faster.
I want to talk a bit about leadership teams, and specifically, in the book, one of the interesting things you talked with Aaron Levy from Box about was COOs. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me your sort of take on what makes a COO successful in a startup?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's lots of different definitions of COO. And so really, COO is a term that could include any subset of functions at the company. It could be a senior executive who includes truly more operationally driven things, which is the O in COO, which would be things like customer support. It could be sales. It could be a variety of things. Or there's sometimes COOs who own product and engineering. And so really what it often means is somebody who is top executive. Sometimes they're in line to replace the CEO, sometimes not. Who has a broad span of responsibilities and who often is more involved in the day-to-day operations of the business versus something that's more strategic in terms of just sitting around and talking about strategy or mapping out strategy, although COOs can do that too. So it really varies a lot, and it comes back to this notion that org structures are exercises in pragmatism. It's what are the things that you need different people to do, what's the bandwidth that they have available, how do you want to organize things? So for example, if you're the CEO, there may be a set of functions that you don't want to do, and those all go to the COO. So for example, when Zuck had Sheryl Sandberg come on board at Facebook, she ended up owning different business functions and other operationally centric functions. And in part, my understanding is because Zuck wanted to focus on product and engineering, and that's where he wanted to spend most of his time, although obviously he was also involved with the business side. So I think the CEO could mean almost anything, and it really depends on the partnership that's formed between the CEO and that person.
Do you recommend to founders at any point that they should start looking for them?
Yes, but it's very contextual. So if you have a very strong executive team and all the different areas are covered properly and you have the right number of reports where you don't feel overwhelmed and you don't have a COO, that's fine. If you have that same situation and you do have a COO, that's fine too. I think often the things that a COO can do can be split across a few different people, or they can be consolidated in one, or maybe somebody has a different title, but they're effectively playing the role of a COO. So for example, at Polyvore, one of the, I think it was the CFO, who took on much more than a CFO normally would, and so she was effectively playing the role of a COO, but was called CFO. So I think it's title versus what the person's actually doing.
And so, focusing on the CEO role for a little bit, you articulated in the book that sort of the main functions of a CEO are to set direction and communicate it, to hire the team, to keep money in the bank, and then to sort of be the chief culture setter for the company, for lack of a better term. What are the areas that you most commonly see CEOs getting hung up on, or where they start to fall short?
Yeah, I think there's two areas. One is on executive hiring. So are they actually putting the right people in place on their teams? And part of that could be they just don't know how to hire for a certain role, or part of it may be that they have somebody that they've been working with for the last 4 years who was crucial for the early days of the company, but now isn't scaling properly, and they leave them in place too long. And so, the biggest issues tend to be people issues if everything else is working. And by everything else, I mean you have product market fit, things are scaling, people are buying your product, and have some differentiation there. And so then it really comes down to saying, okay, I have this product that's working. How do I start viewing my company as a product? And how do I create a roadmap for my company? And how do I think about the features of the company? And that could be your culture, that could be your executive team, that could be your people. And so I think you need that mind shift.
You touched on something that I think many, I'm sure people watching, and I know I've experienced, the early employee who is now going through the company scale and may or may not be sort of hanging on through it. How does one decide whether to keep investing into these early employees who have so much context and who have so much loyalty to deciding, okay, it's time to bring in somebody from the outside?
Yeah. Early employees can be ridiculously valuable as a company scales because, to your point, they have organizational knowledge, they understand how things work in the company, they understand the processes. They can also kill sacred cows, so they can say, hey, 5 years ago, I'm actually the person who came up with this idea, and I now think it's a bad idea. Let's get rid of it, right? So, and they also have the trust of the founders and the executive team. So early employees are fantastic to have on board. What tends to happen, though, is that a subset of early employees may start to feel disconnected from the company. And it could be because they used to sit next to the CEO and have lunch with them every day, and that no longer happens, so they don't have influence over every decision. It could be because their role is evolving. And in general, as a company scales, early employees tend to go through an inflection point where most of them lose a lot of responsibility before they later gain a lot of responsibility. So an example of that would be, say you're the first designer on a team, and you're designing everything, and you have to say on every single piece of the product. And then the company grows to 100 people, and suddenly there's 4 designers on the team. And so you're doing one piece of a product, and 3 other people are doing other pieces of it. You may start to feel like your role is shrinking, like you're being marginalized, but what you don't realize is that when the company suddenly hits 500 people, maybe you're the director of that group. Or maybe you're running a equivalently sized team, but for one key or core area. Or maybe you're working on the next product, which is really going to drive the company in the market. And so you have to realize that your role will almost undoubtedly shrink, and then it'll expand back, and you need to be okay with that shrinking. And usually the places where I see early employees stumble is being upset about the shrinking and being upset about more experienced people coming in with ideas around process or other things, when those ideas are actually very good ideas, but they're not the way that things used to be done. And that's where you end up with a lot of fights. So Ruchi Sanghvi, who was early at Facebook and then later at Dropbox, talks about her experiences in the book around, at Facebook, she said she was the person who was fighting the executives coming in and was the one who said, why are we changing things? And then at Dropbox, she was the old timer coming in trying to implement processes. And so, she was on both sides of that at different stages of her career.
There was some first-round article, I don't know if you've read it, about giving away your Legos and the importance of being willing to do that as the company scales. Do you think that it is important for early employees to make sure that it stays sort of underneath their control, or do you think it's okay for employees to just sort of give away influence and sort of trust that the organization will take care of them?
Yeah, I think ultimately the early employees that tend to be successful over a long arc are the ones who give things away and realize that they'll gain more influence by being collaborative than by holding everything close.
So I want to talk about a particular area, product management. Mm-hmm. It changes at the early days, and when the company's larger and the roadmap is bigger. But what structures of a product management team have you seen be successful?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different approaches to product management. I think only a very small number of companies in technology actually do it well. Facebook does it well, Google does it well. I think some parts of Square do it well, but in general, most companies aren't great at it. And I think in part it's driven by the fact that they have the wrong people in place playing the role of product managers, because just like any other discipline, product management is a discipline, and you want people who are actually trained in it, who think a certain way, and who approach problems with a certain set of processes that are sort of best practices in terms of things like writing product requirement docs, in terms of how they communicate, in terms of how they build product roadmaps, coordinate with the team, et cetera. And so it's sort of like, say that you had a really great marketing person, and you said, hey, we're short on engineers, why don't you start writing code? That probably wouldn't work out very well. But that's what happens at many companies when the CEO or one of the founders, who's often playing the product role, needs somebody to help them, and they choose somebody randomly across the org in some cases and say, hey, why don't you come help me with this? Instead of thinking of it as a real discipline or something that people can accumulate knowledge in. And so I think the biggest mistake is trying to convert somebody without a product background who may not be suited for the role into a product role, and then hoping that that person scales. Most of the time that person does not, although sometimes they do. And if they don't scale, then sometimes the CEO or the executive is left thinking, oh, product management isn't a good discipline, when really they just had the wrong person in place.
Do you tend to prefer product managers who have come from an engineering or sort of a product builder discipline versus engineers who have come from sort of a go-to-market or a strategy side?
Yeah, I think product managers can come from either direction, and ultimately there's different product roles in a company. You may have something that Google used to call business product managers, who were effectively outbound PMs who would work with different partners or companies and take feedback or input from them and the sales team and feed it back into engineering and create sort of roadmaps that were more customer driven. You often see this at enterprise companies. And then there's product managers who maybe focus on a consumer product, and they may have more of a design-centric background. Or you may have product managers working on very technical products, like a search product, in which case they may have a very strong engineering background. So it really comes, and then obviously there's growth PMs, and they may come from more of either a quant background or a marketing background. So it really depends on what the actual role is, and then that'll drive who may be the best fit for it.
Let's think of the sort of head of product or the VP of product. How should that person allocate their time between thinking about time with customers, market strategy, competition, versus technical implementation, the roadmap, delivering, executing?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the type of company that person is in, and then who their peer group is and how good are they. And so ultimately, the best VP products are collaborating closely with the person running engineering, with the person running sales, et cetera. And it's a bit of a team effort in terms of how that group works together. What happens is sometimes if you have a really strong executive or vice president and then some weaker people, then that also changes sort of what that role means during that specific moment of time of the company. And so I think it's less prescriptive, and it's just going to keep evolving.
I've noticed a lot of founders are often very hesitant to give away sort of control of the roadmap, and hiring a VP of product is often one of the last things that founders want to give up. Do you think that is a good pattern, or do you think people should be giving that up and hiring a VP of product sooner?
Yeah, I would separate hiring a VP of product from giving up the roadmap. Ultimately the founders or the CEO is going to be the final arbiter of what the roadmap is and what's going to get built. And so that shouldn't be a fear. What it is about getting leverage in a function. And so sure, you as the CEO could also go and run spreadsheets and be the person doing finance, but it's probably better if you hire somebody to actually run that function for you. Product is no different, and I think the CEO should continue to be involved in product, especially if it's something they really care about. But they need to be able to offload an entire organization and a function and a set of processes and approaches to somebody else, so that they can free up bandwidth to actually really be able to weigh in on a roadmap instead of trying to troubleshoot things.
As a final question, as we part, what is the most important piece of advice that you give to a founder who is entering or believes they're about to be entering hypergrowth mode?
I think the single most important thing is to start thinking about your company as a product and your organization as a product, and start to roadmap that out. What's the organizational scaffolding on which everything else can hang? Because without that, things are going to break really fast.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.